Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. As the sun slowly rose, everything seemed ordinary in the Leimert Park neighborhood. It was a cold morning, and the concrete streets still carried the remnants of the night. People had started their daily routines, preparing for work and sipping their morning coffees. Betty Bersinger, a young mother, was out for a walk with her 3-year-old daughter. It was a routine she had developed, getting some fresh air, clearing her mind, and starting the day with energy. As she walked along with her little girl, they approached an empty lot. At that time, Los Angeles was a rapidly growing city, and such vacant lots weren't uncommon. But on that day, this lot was different. Betty's eyes caught sight of something white on the ground. At first, she thought it was a store mannequin. During those years, stores sometimes discarded old or broken mannequins. But as she took a few more steps closer, a deep unease washed over her. What she had initially thought to be a mannequin was, in fact, a person. The body was naked, horrifyingly severed in half. It was positioned upside down, arms stretched upwards. The cuts were precise, almost surgical. But the most terrifying detail was the face. The young woman's eyes stared vacantly ahead. The corners of her mouth had grotesquely been slashed up to her ears. It gave her a chilling, deathly grin. Betty screamed, quickly covered her daughter's eyes, and hurried back. Her heart raced and her breath became irregular. For a moment, she felt as if her body had frozen. She wanted to believe it wasn't real, that she had seen wrong. But after a few seconds, the fear inside her gave way to a painful truth. This was a murder, a horrifying murder. In a panic, Betty ran to the nearest house and called the police. The officer on the other end of the line immediately recognized the gravity of the situation when he heard her trembling voice. Within moments, several police cars arrived at the scene. Officers carefully advanced through the lot. One of the first detectives to arrive was Frank Jemison. He was an experienced officer and had seen many crime scenes in Los Angeles, but this was the most horrific sight he had ever encountered. There wasn't a single drop of blood around the body. This meant the young woman hadn't been killed here, but had been murdered somewhere else and brought to this spot. The body had been washed after the murder. Was this a message? A signature? Left behind? Detectives, including Frank Jemison, examined the area closely. There were tire tracks nearby. Someone had driven a car here. Several shoe prints were also found near the body. However, the prints weren't clear, as if someone had intentionally tried to wipe them away. One of the detectives, after examining the position of the body and how it had been cut, sighed deeply. "This was done by a professional," he said. "The cuts are too clean. Whoever did this must have medical knowledge. No serial killer had ever used such a method before." The victim's body had been cut with surgical precision. It didn't look like a random attack. The police searched the area around the body for a bag, wallet, or any identification, but found nothing. Who was this young woman? Who had done this to her? While the investigation at the crime scene continued, the police took the body to the morgue to identify her. At the time, fingerprints were used for identification, so the Los Angeles police sent the victim's prints to the FBI. The result came back shockingly fast. The victim was Elizabeth Short. The 22-year-old woman was originally from Massachusetts and had come to Hollywood to pursue her dream of stardom. However, since arriving, her life had not been easy. She had no stable place to stay, often lodging in hotels or with acquaintances. During the day, she spent time in bars or cafes, and at night, she would disappear among the bright lights of Hollywood. The media quickly took a great interest in the murder. The Los Angeles Examiner newspaper sensationalized the case, giving Elizabeth Short the nickname Black Dahlia. But one question remained. Who killed Elizabeth Short? The sky was clear and sunny, but beneath the city's bright lights, dark secrets were hidden. In the 1940s, Los Angeles was famous for its glamorous Hollywood world. Thousands of young women flocked to the city, hoping to make their mark and find fame and fortune. But the splendor promised by the city was often nothing more than an illusion. and Elizabeth Short would become one of the cruelest victims of that illusion. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in a small town in Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 sisters. Her father, Cleo Short, had lost his job during the Great Depression and abandoned the family. For a time, he was thought to have committed suicide, but years later, it was revealed that he was alive and living in California. Her mother, Phoebe Short, had to raise 5 daughters on her own. Elizabeth had been a dreamer since her childhood. She grew up watching movies and was enchanted by the magical world of Hollywood. Her biggest dream was to one day become a famous actress. As a teenager, Elizabeth suffered from frequent illnesses like asthma and bronchitis. Doctors advised that the cold weather in Massachusetts wasn't good for her health, so she decided to move to California at a young age. The warm weather and the allure of Hollywood called to her. In 1943, when Elizabeth moved to Los Angeles, she was just 19 years old. During Hollywood's golden age, anyone had the chance to become a star in everyone's eyes. But the real world was not as glamorous as the silver screen. When she first arrived, she temporarily stayed with her father. However, their relationship was tense and she soon had to leave his house. Living alone as a young woman wasn't easy. She struggled financially, sometimes working in bars or accepting help from wealthy men. At that time, one of the easiest ways for young women to make money was by working in bars or as a hostess. Elizabeth took on temporary jobs but could never secure a permanent career. She tried to meet producers in Hollywood but never landed a real film role. Her dream began to feel more like a distant star. Throughout her years in Los Angeles, Elizabeth met many people, most of them men who admired her beauty. With her black hair, porcelain skin, and deep blue eyes, she drew everyone's attention. Many men who met her found her pure, alluring, and somewhat mysterious. Elizabeth often preferred to wear black dresses, which is why those around her nicknamed her Black Dahlia. Meanwhile, she was getting dragged into a dark story that would later inspire James Ellroy's book. She frequently spent time in Hollywood's famous bars, the Florentine Gardens, the Crown Grill, the Melody Room. These places were filled with famous producers, gangsters, rich businessmen, and desperate actors. Some nights she would party with champagne, while other nights she went hungry due to a lack of money. By January 1947, Elizabeth Short's life had become increasingly uncertain. In the last few weeks, she had been known to stay at various places, sometimes with former boyfriends, sometimes in hotels, and sometimes in the homes of newly met people. January 9, 1947, was the last day Elizabeth Short was seen alive. That night, she was known to have met a man at the Biltmore Hotel. According to witnesses, she appeared somewhat uneasy while sitting there. Was she waiting for someone, or was she being followed? As the night went on, Elizabeth left the hotel. She was later said to have gone to a bar called the Crown Grill, but after that, no one saw her alive again. She disappeared for exactly 6 days. What had happened during those days? Where had she stayed? Who was she with? Nobody knew. When Elizabeth Short's body was found, the police were shocked by the brutality of the crime. This was not a random murder. It was like a work of art, a death with a message embedded in it. The media quickly seized the murder case and transformed Elizabeth into a completely different person. Newspapers presented her to the public with distorted stories, calling her Hollywood prostitute or nightclub woman. Yet Elizabeth had no known history of sex work. She was simply a young woman with dreams of becoming famous. The press, especially the Los Angeles Examiner, sensationalized the case. The nickname Black Dahlia added a mysterious and chilling aura to the murder. The media began digging into Elizabeth's personal life. They scrutinized her boyfriend's nightlife and attempts to make money. Some reporters tried to portray Elizabeth as guilty in some way. They attempted to create the image that even a woman who had been murdered was the victim of her own mistakes. But the truth was she had been a victim, and her killer was still out there. What Elizabeth Short had been doing before her death, where she had been, and who she had been with were never fully revealed. Her death remained one of the darkest secrets behind Hollywood's glittering mask, and, on that day, another woman disappeared in Los Angeles, never to return again. The Los Angeles Police Department began working intensively to solve the Black Dahlia murder. However, this case was far more complicated than a typical murder investigation. The manner in which the murder was carried out, the way the victim's body had been cut, and the absence of blood at the crime scene all indicated that this was not a random attack. The killer was either someone with medical knowledge or a psychopath with sadistic intelligence. Fear and paranoia began to spread throughout the city. The press kept the case in the headlines, and the public rushed to the newspapers every day to read new details. The murder was exposing the dark truths lurking beneath Hollywood's shiny world. The investigation team was led by Detective Harry Hansen and Detective Finnis Brown. Both were among the most experienced detectives in the Los Angeles Police Department. However, when they first stepped into the case, they realized that it would be one of the most difficult files to solve. The first big question: who was Elizabeth Short with before her murder? The detectives began speaking to witnesses to determine where Elizabeth had been in her final days and who she had met. They knew she was last seen at the Biltmore Hotel. Some witnesses claimed she appeared to be waiting for someone there, but the identity of this person was unknown. The second big question: how was the murder committed? Forensic experts determined that Elizabeth's body had been cut with surgical precision. The body was split in two, and some of her internal organs had been removed. The perfection of the cut suggested that they were not made with an ordinary knife. This indicated that the killer was either someone with surgical knowledge or an experienced butcher or anatomist. Forensic experts reported that Elizabeth died from severe blunt force trauma and blood loss. However, there was one interesting detail. Her body had been completely drained of blood. The killer had either washed the body or used a technique to drain the blood from her body before killing her. Another important detail was that Elizabeth's mouth had been slit from ear to ear. This method had previously been used by some mafias in South America. Was this murder a message? Elizabeth Short had met many people in Hollywood. Most of them were men, and some were known to have shown interest in her. The detectives began examining the people Elizabeth had recently been in contact with to identify potential suspects. Red was one of Elizabeth's last known boyfriends. He was a married man who had been briefly involved with Elizabeth. According to his statement to the police, he had dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th and never saw her again. Red passed the lie detector test, and it was determined that he had no connection to the murder. Hansen ran a nightclub in Hollywood and knew Elizabeth. Some sources suggested that Hansen had romantic feelings for her, but Elizabeth did not want a relationship with him. Detectives found some of Elizabeth's belongings at Hansen's home. However, there was no concrete evidence to prove he was the killer. Hodel was a wealthy and influential doctor, well-versed in pathology and surgery. Because the murder required professional cutting, detectives focused their attention on him. Years later, some evidence would surface through Hodel's own son's research, suggesting that he might have been involved in the case. The police interrogated over 75 suspects, but none of them had enough evidence against them. Just as the investigation seemed to hit a dead end, a shocking letter arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper. In the letter, someone claiming to be the killer wrote, "I enjoyed killing the Black Dahlia. The police will never catch me." But there was something even more terrifying in the letter. Some of Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, an identification card, a birth certificate, and photographs. These items suggested that the person who sent the letter might indeed be the killer. However, the police could not determine the identity of the person who wrote the letter. The letters were cut out and pasted, making it impossible to identify the handwriting. The killer later sent other cryptic messages to the newspapers. However, the police were unable to follow the clues to reach a conclusion. It was as though the killer was playing a game with the police. As the press kept pushing the Black Dahlia murder story to the headlines, the people of Los Angeles were gripped by fear. Many believed that the murder was the work of a serial killer. Young women in particular became afraid to go out at night. The newspapers exaggerated the details of the case and speculated wildly about Elizabeth Short's lifestyle. But the Truth was that Elizabeth was simply a young woman with dreams of fame, and she had tragically become the victim of a horrifying murder. Weeks passed, yet the murder remained unsolved. New theories emerged every day, but no clue was enough to reveal the killer's identity. Los Angeles had been put on high alert to find the Black Dahlia's killer, but the question remained: was the killer one step ahead? The city was shaken by the brutality of the Black Dahlia murder. People read the newspapers in fear, hoping for new developments. However, the police had very few leads. The 6 days before Elizabeth Short's body was found remained a great mystery. This period began to be referred to as the Lost Days. After Elizabeth Short was seen at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th, she disappeared without a trace. When her mutilated body was found in a vacant lot on the morning of January 15th, there was no solid evidence of where she had been during those 6 days. The detectives were investigating every clue to uncover what had happened to Elizabeth during this time. Who had kidnapped her? Where had she been kept? How and when was the murder committed? Detectives Hansen and Brown started detailing Elizabeth's disappearance from the last known sighting on January 9th. Here's what was known. On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth was dropped off in Los Angeles by a married man named Red Manley. She was last seen at the Biltmore Hotel. According to witnesses, she was waiting to meet someone there. However, no one saw her leave the hotel. From January 10 to 14, 1947, there was no word from Elizabeth. No one saw her, she made no phone calls, and she didn't contact any acquaintances. It was suspected that the murder took place during these days. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman's body was found near Leimert Park. The body was split in two, drained of all blood, and tortured. The police had the body taken to the coroner's office for identification. During these 6 lost days, Elizabeth Short's whereabouts remained a mystery. However, some theories began to emerge. The police interrogated many people to try to determine what Elizabeth had been doing during this time, but witnesses claimed that no one had seen her. Could a person disappear completely for 6 days? Some detectives believed that Elizabeth had been kidnapped and tortured. The way her body was mutilated suggested that the killer had spent a long time with her. Some experts noticed that the wounds on Elizabeth's body appeared to have been inflicted over different periods. This indicated that she hadn't been killed suddenly but had been tortured over the course of several days. According to this theory, the killer had kidnapped Elizabeth and imprisoned her in a house or basement. Over the days, she had been starved and physically harmed. Before killing her, her mouth had been slit from ear to ear, inflicting further pain. This form of torture pointed to a compulsive and sadistic killer. Some witnesses claimed that Elizabeth occasionally attended private parties in Hollywood. These parties were attended by wealthy producers, mafia connections, and suspicious characters. If Elizabeth had attended a party on January 9th and encountered the wrong people there, it could have led to her tragic end. According to this theory, Elizabeth may have been invited by a film producer or a wealthy man. During the party, she might have argued with someone or been forced into something she didn't want to do. The killer may have murdered her horrifically to silence her. However, there was no solid evidence to prove this theory. The surgical precision with which Elizabeth's body had been cut increased the suspicion that the killer might have had a medical background. One of the biggest suspects investigated by the Los Angeles Police Department was Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy and respected doctor. Hodel was living a prestigious life in Los Angeles, but it was soon revealed that he harbored dark secrets. He was accused of abusing women and conducting certain experiments. Even his own son believed that his father could be involved in the Black Dahlia murder. However, no concrete evidence was ever found against Hodel. As the investigation continued, the detectives found themselves hitting more and more dead ends. The killer seemed to be taunting the police by leaving clues, only to then vanish without a trace. A murder is usually solved in one of two ways. The killer makes a mistake and gets caught. A witness speaks up. But in the case of the Black Dahlia, no witness came forward and the killer never made a mistake. The mystery deepened. The police knew what had caused Elizabeth's death. They also knew who she had met in her final days, but the police didn't know who the killer was. Suspects were being questioned, new clues were being examined, but time and again, the evidence was insufficient. As time passed, the public's interest in solving the case waned, and hopes of solving the murder began to fade. However, whispers circulated on the streets of Los Angeles. The killer was still free, and perhaps still searching for a new victim. Weeks had passed since the Black Dahlia murder, but detectives still couldn't find a way forward. Hundreds of suspects had been questioned, dozens of tips followed up on, but no clear clue had been found about the killer. The people of Los Angeles were tired of reading new theories in the newspapers every day. Some claimed that the police were knowingly protecting the killer, while others thought it was a mafia-related murder. Fear and paranoia were growing in the city. On January 21, 1947, an envelope arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper. When the police and journalists opened it, they were frozen in shock. Inside the envelope were some of Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, a bus ticket thought to be from the night of the murder, a cryptic note. But the most chilling part was the message written on the envelope. "I killed the Black Dahlia. I'll keep playing with the police for fun." The killer was playing a game with the police. This indicated that he felt invincible. The fingerprints on the envelope had been deliberately wiped away, showing the killer was extremely careful not to leave any evidence. The cryptic note seemed to offer some clues about his identity, but the police couldn't decode its meaning. Detectives Hansen and Brown decided to look into some suspects more closely after receiving the letter. 3 names stood out. Dr. George Hodel, known for his deviant behavior in police records. Given his surgical knowledge, he could have been the one to dissect Elizabeth's body so precisely. A phone tap at his house allegedly caught him saying, "I killed the Black Dahlia, but they can't prove it." Mark Hansen, a man known in Hollywood's nightlife and closely acquainted with Elizabeth Short. Some of Elizabeth's belongings were found at his house. The exact nature of their connection remained unclear. Walter Bailey, a former surgeon. His house was very close to the location where Elizabeth's body was found. The way the body had been cut suggested that it could have been someone with surgical knowledge. However, no solid evidence against any of them was found. The failure to solve the case angered the public. Rumors began to spread that the police department was covering up the murder. The press, meanwhile, sensationalized the case, fueling public fear. The Black Dahlia had become more than just a murder victim. She had turned into a media icon. Some newspapers went so far as to twist Elizabeth Short's life, portraying her as a femme fatale, a dangerous woman. This led many people to believe that she had been killed for getting involved with the wrong men. However, the truth was that Elizabeth Short was just a young woman hoping to build a career in Hollywood. She had become a victim of extreme violence and sadism. Meanwhile, some detectives started to believe that the killer might have been someone from a high position. Could the failure to solve the case have been accidental, or was someone protecting the killer? While following the clues, the police received an anonymous phone call one night that directed the investigation in a new direction. The voice on the phone said, "You're following the wrong people. The killer is someone much more powerful. He needs to be searched for higher up." This tip reinforced the thought that the case might not be just about a psychopath, but part of a larger conspiracy. Was the killer really a doctor? Or were there people protecting him, covering up the crime? The Black Dahlia case continued to grow more complicated. Weeks and months passed, but no matter how much the detectives investigated, the killer always seemed to be one step ahead. So who was the killer? Was the police actually protecting him? Or was he a ghost hiding in the darkest corners of Los Angeles? One final question remained. Would they ever catch him? Months had passed since the Black Dahlia murder. As the Los Angeles Police Department deepened the investigation, the case became even more complex. Newspapers were filled with new headlines every day, but what the public wanted most was clear. They wanted the killer found. However, with each passing day, hope seemed to dwindle. The killer appeared to have vanished into the shadows, playing a game with the police before completely erasing his traces. So could the killer truly never be found? Or was there someone who didn't want him to be caught? The list of potential suspects in the Black Dahlia case was growing. The police had questioned dozens of people, generated different theories, but had been unable to conclusively prove any of them. Some of the suspects had powerful connections. The police couldn't dismiss the possibility that the killer might have been someone from a high position. Some detectives began to consider that the case might not just be a murder, but part of a much larger conspiracy. One of the most prominent names among the suspects was Dr. George Hodel. His medical knowledge and dark past connections made him a strong candidate. However, due to a lack of evidence, Hodel was never arrested. Strangely, even years later, members of the Hodel family claimed that he was behind the Black Dahlia murder. His son, Steve Hodel, wrote books asserting his father's guilt and found numerous suspicious connections when reviewing police records. However, the case was never officially solved. In the early days of the investigation, there were talks of some critical mistakes made by the police. The first police teams to arrive at the crime scene failed to preserve potential evidence around the body. Not only that, some critical documents disappeared. Files on certain suspects were suddenly closed. And most importantly, some of the names on the suspect list were never even questioned. This led to the spread of a conspiracy theory among the public. Was there someone within the police department covering up the crime? Was Elizabeth Short's murder a simple case of a psychotic killer? Or was there a bigger force behind it? The investigation lasted for years. But as no conclusive clues were found about the killer, the case was cold-filed in the 1950s. However, the public never forgot about Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short became one of Hollywood's most mysterious murder victims. Even after many decades, the case remains one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries. Though the case was never officially solved, shocking new claims surfaced over the years. In the 2000s, when old police records were reviewed, it was discovered that a listening device had been placed in Dr. George Hodel's house. In one of the recordings, it was claimed that Hodel said, "Of course I killed the Black Dahlia, but they can't prove it." However, the continuation of the recordings was never found, and this confession was never used as official evidence. While researching his father's old belongings, Steve Hodel found a photograph of a woman who resembled the Black Dahlia. This photo suggested that Elizabeth Short might have had a connection to Dr. George Hodel before her death. However, it was still not considered conclusive evidence. The Black Dahlia case eventually became more than just a criminal case. It turned into one of Hollywood's biggest mysteries. Elizabeth Short's tragic death has been repeatedly explored in popular culture. Books were written about it. Films and documentaries were made. People claim to have seen her ghost. Even though the murder was never solved, Elizabeth Short's story was never forgotten. Today, there are still various theories surrounding the Black Dahlia case. Was Dr. George Hodel guilty? Was Elizabeth killed by a powerful figure in Los Angeles? Was this murder the work of a serial killer? Regardless of the answers, Elizabeth Short's death has left a dark and bloody page in the history of Los Angeles. Years have passed since the murder, but one question still hangs in the air. Will the Black Dahlia's killer ever be found? Or will this murder remain unsolved forever?